I am now explaining to Natasha Romanoff exactly how powerful I am, and then I said basically my powers are beyond every multiverse and every universe in existence because the infinity force is tied to creation itself. I am what you would call an outer god. A Beander sort of, and then I formed a miniature Earth in my hands, and then I said I have the powers to create anything, and then I created a miniature Sun in my other hand, but I also have the powers to destroy, and then I erased the miniature Earth from existence, and then I created a moon, and I said come here Natasha Romanoff, and she smiled really big, and I said hold this, and then she held the miniature moon in the palm of her hand, and then I said I have given you the moon Natasha Romanoff, and then I sat behind her while she held the moon in her hands, and then Natasha Romanoff said this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen, this is a real moon, I can feel the cold air coming off of it, and after that Natasha Romanoff got so sexually aroused she couldn't hold back anymore, and she made love to me again, and she put the small moon on a mount that I created, and every time Natasha looked at the miniature moon she got aroused very well for some reason, and by the time we finally stopped having sex she was breathing heavy laying beside me, and then Natasha Romanoff said I've been meaning to ask you about this scar on your hand, it's in the shape of an infinity symbol, is it a birthmark? And then I said actually no it's not, I got this scar after touching Jessica Jones' brother Philip Jones. You see my mutant ability and powers allow me to permanently copy anyone's abilities or powers, no matter how powerful they are I can copy anyone's powers, and when I touched Philip Jones this happened. Apparently the kid had some kind of special powers called the Infinity Force, and now that power is a part of me too. And then Nick Fury finally called Natasha Romanoff after 3 days of her having sex with me, and then I asked Natasha Romanoff what's wrong, and then Natasha Romanoff said there's something I need to tell you, they found a hammer near New Mexico, and they also found Captain America, and then I asked Natasha Romanoff I thought Captain America was dead, and then Natasha Romanoff said apparently not, he's just been thawed out from a block of ice, and then I said I want to see if I can lift Thor's hammer and you can go see Captain America if you want to Natasha Romanoff, and then Natasha Romanoff looked at me and smirked, we are both going to Thor's hammer, and then I said well your friend Hawkeye is there so it might be a bit conflicted maybe, and then I said I'm just kidding, I assumed that Nick Fury probably wants to see if I can lift that hammer and he might want to send you somewhere else, maybe that's all I'm saying. And then Natasha Romanoff smiled like a pervert and she said we got a bit of time before we need to leave, we can have a quickie first, Natasha Romanoff said, and then I said I've never done a quickie before and I don't even think I can do a quickie sexually or whatever, and then Natasha Romanoff said yes you can, and then Natasha Romanoff made love to me very fast in every sexual position, and then I decided to allow myself to come quickly, and then Natasha Romanoff said see I told you. You can do it but don't get in the habit of doing that all the time please, and then I said yes ma'am I won't, I promise, and then Natasha Romanoff and I went out separate ways. For now Nick Fury wants me at New Mexico, so I went to New Mexico with Phil Coulson, and something funny happened on the way to Thor's hammer and I helped Phil Coulson handle the situation. Let's just say that the whole situation was a kidnapping and a robbery gone wrong, and we resolved the situation a lot faster than the original storyline, and then we finally made it to Thor's hammer, and then I said to Coulson maybe it's best that we never talk about what happened earlier, and then Phil Coulson laughed and said it's going to be hard not to, you did a great job sir, Phil Coulson said to me, and then I said you too, and then I said screw it, tell whoever you want about it, and then Nick Fury got some popcorn and he sat down in the front row so to speak, and he told Clint Barton to sit down and relax. Clint, let's watch and see if he can do it, and then Clint said popcorn sir, really, and then Nick Fury said watching him is like watching a movie, just wait you will see, and then I bent down said hi Mjolnir, and then Phil Coulson was standing right next to me, and then I said you might want to back up for this because I got a feeling this hammer isn't normal, and then Phil Coulson said oh I'm not leaving this spot for now, and then I said suit yourself, and then I gripped the handle, and when I did lightning started to dance around Mjolnir and me, and I used my powers to contain the lightning so it didn't harm Phil Coulson, and then in one swift motion I lifted Mjolnir high above my head as if it were nothing, and then suddenly I shouted I have the power.